Hello.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Russ Eshelman, and on behalf of the Journalism Department in the College of Communications, I'd like to welcome you tonight to our panel being called Campaign to Remember. Truth be told, this was not, the title was not something that we developed after last Tuesday night. It's been in the works for quite a while, as has the entire panel discussion idea. We're lucky this year that this is something we've done, by the way, I think the last 2 or 3 presidential elections. It's been our practice to ask journalists who were involved in covering the campaigns to come back and provide our journalism students especially with some tips and some information about how they covered the campaigns and just sort of talk about the experience. We'll do that same thing tonight, although I'm sure we'll probably get into some other issues tonight as well. The other thing I'd like to mention tonight, what's really nice for us, is that all 3 of our panelists are recent Penn State alums. And I'll introduce them in a few moments. The idea for that, I have to give credit to our Dean, Ford Risley. We were talking about putting this thing together several months ago. He had seen one of these guys that had a story someplace and suggested, we should try to put together an entire panel with our graduates. And I had known that I think you probably saw something that Kevin had done. I had known that Ann and Casey had both gotten involved in the government campaign as well, so that's sort of how this whole thing came together. So we're really fortunate that we have 3 homegrown folks to tell us about the presidential election this year. A little bit about the format. What we'll do is this. I'm going to give a brief introduction of the panel, and then I'll ask each of them to talk a little bit about specifically what they did during covering the campaigns. We'll move on to other issues throughout the evening. I'd like to ask a few questions, but I'd like to ask you to ask most of the questions. So please think of some things you'd like to hear from these panelists, and I'm sure they'll do their best to answer for you. At this point, let me introduce the panel. On the other side of the panel here is Anna Orso. Anna is a reporter and a curator for BillyPenn.com in Philadelphia. She's covered politics from her post in Philadelphia, including she covered the Democratic National Convention this year during the last week of July. Before Anna joined BillyPenn.com, she worked at the Harrisburg Patriot News and the Penn Live website. She started working there upon her graduation from Penn State in 2014. While here, Anna was the managing editor of the Daily Collegian her junior year, and in her senior year, tried to do something wild, which was to cover football. And so that's what she did. And also, I should mention that while Anna was here, during her sophomore year and during her senior year, she was a finalist in the Hearst National Writing Contest, which is quite an extraordinary feat. The Hearst contest includes entries from more than 100 schools across the country, and stories are written throughout the academic year. Stories are whittled down traveling the country, and I guess it's maybe beyond the country too, as an embedded reporter and covering the Trump campaign. Before he went to Bloomberg, Kevin worked in Washington for the Hill newspaper as well as Politico. And while a student here at Penn State, and you'll see a theme here, Kevin was also, I think he was the campus editor. And what I recall specifically, because I was on that trip, is that we lost Kevin for a while. And we were a little worried.
I was wondering if you remembered this.
And we didn't have to put an all points bulletin out. We finally found it, but he was with the mayor of Cape Town the entire day, which I think says something about why Kevin is doing what he's doing now. He got politics in his blood at an early age, I guess. Beside Kevin and beside me is Casey McDermott. Casey is a 2013 graduate of Penn State, our journalism program. She also majored in English. She spent the last year covering politics and public policy for New Hampshire Public Radio, and before that, the Concord Monitor. So Casey was on the scene in those snowy days of February during the primary season when candidates were going through their, probably as many as 24, I guess, if you count all the Republican candidates, the Democratic candidates, as well as some of the would-be minor party candidates. While Casey was here at Penn State, she was both the managing editor and then ultimately the editor-in-chief of the Daily Collegian. She was also here at the time in which she directed most of the Collegian's Jerry Sandusky scandal coverage and did a fine job with that. She also was a member of the international reporting class while she was here. She went to Brazil, and actually Anna was a member of the class that went to China, right? So those are brief introductions. What I'd like them to do now is to tell you exactly what they do for their day jobs now in covering politics. So Anna, why don't you start us off?
Can everyone hear me? I'm Anna Orso. I am a reporter curator at billypenn.com. We are a mobile-focused digital news organization based in Philadelphia. We're just over 2 years old, and we write about local news in the city. So obviously the Democratic National Convention in July was huge for us. That was a huge local story. But we also do a lot of reporting on politics, and so heading into the general election as it was clear Pennsylvania was becoming even more of a swing state, we were covering every appearance from a presidential candidate in sort of our general area, doing stories about their efforts in the state, whether it's comparing their advertising in the state or looking at their get out the vote efforts or sort of whatever that may be. Sort of covered that pretty extensively. Saw Kevin at a couple rallies or two in the Philadelphia area. And then we also covered the Pennsylvania Senate race very extensively as well, which, as I'm sure if any of you have seen commercials in the last month or so, was very expensive and very close and contentious. So that's pretty much what I was doing for the last 6 to 8 months.
My name is Kevin Cirilli. I cover Donald Trump for Bloomberg News and all of its enterprises. And pretty much my job is to track Donald Trump and go wherever he goes and just cover every single second of Trump world, as I call it. So I've been, last week in the final week of the campaign, we were on more than 30 flights and averaging 5 to 6 states a day. And my job is to just present the happenings before anyone else of the inner workings of Trump's inner circle, but to also chronicle his movement and what that represents at this particular moment in American culture.
I'm Casey, and I have been with New Hampshire Public Radio for the last year, during which time I've focused mostly on state-level politics and policy coverage. That's included covering our gubernatorial race. They did send me to the DNC to cover our New Hampshire delegation down there in July, and I've also helped out with other kind of political presidential coverage. But as Russ alluded to, before that, I was with the Concord Monitor, which is the capital newspaper in New Hampshire. So starting as early as fall of 2014, we started to see people who would go on to become presidential candidates parading through, doing town halls, doing rallies, just kind of trying to reach out to people. So I spent a good year or so following that and following those people around.
And let's start with you. We're all talking about covering the race, but what does that mean in terms of what Billy Penn does? I mean, tell us specifically, are you writing stories? Are you shooting video? What exactly? And since these are journalism students out here, tell them what that means to cover a race.
Yeah, so Billy Penn's a little weird because we try to not do like typical sort of day-to-day horse race type of campaign coverage. So a lot of our focus is more on analytical, sort of like enterprisey sort of stories, but that's also kind of hard to do when you've got presidential candidates in your backyard every day. You cannot cover it. So basically what that meant was, like I said at the beginning, sort of doing these longer, more analytical features for the most part, but whenever there was a visit, whether it was Donald Trump giving a policy speech at like a swanky place in Philadelphia, or having a rally at, the Farm Show Complex in Harrisburg. That basically entailed going, tweeting throughout the rally, taking some video on my phone or whatever that may be. I usually had two phones. I usually had my iPhone, which I would tweet with and take pictures with, and then I had a company phone, which we would use for either live streaming or Snapchat. And then I would kind of write my story as the rally or the event was happening. And would file it 10 to 15 minutes after it was over. And then once that happened, then would either follow up on something that was said or done during that rally, or continue tweeting with people who were asking questions, or on Facebook, or sort of whatever that may be.
Kevin, how about you? You're not writing from one place. You're writing from multiple places all day long, and you're not just writing. Tell us what all you were doing.
So pretty much like the notebook nowadays is your iPhone. And so I remember one time at one rally, and I don't remember the location, but I lost my iPhone. And it was like this huge ordeal. And I literally had a Secret Service agent looking for it, a Trump aide looking for it, and 3 of my colleagues inside the press tent looking for it. And we turned on the like map my phone thing. We could see it like going all over, and we had like this whole hunt. But the importance of that is that was my gateway to my editors, my readers, the public, and my notes, my sources. So much of political journalism now is done through text message and done through email. And you're constantly, because you're never in the same time zone, and your sources aren't in the same time zone, so you're constantly having to gauge your questions through communication on text messaging, which I think is not something that people would expect in journalism school, but that really is the cultural norm in the industry currently. And pretty much you wake up and you check in with your sources, and you check in with your competitors, and that sort of drives the day's cycle. And I say cycle, but I think that it really has become instantaneous, because what you're doing from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. is like a week in politics compared to what will drive the evening news that night. And so your story might go viral in the morning, but in the second half of the day, what you're talking about on television is something completely different. So I guess that's just a long way of saying that you have to be incredibly flexible, you have to take care of yourself, and you have to pace yourself, and really present yourself as someone who is trying to discern information and report it in a way that is fast, first, and accurate. And that has always been, I think, the message that my editors have given me, and that I actually learned at the Collegiate and Penn State as well.
Casey, how about from the broadcast perspective? You didn't use your iPhone, I assume, as much as you had a regular tape recorder.
Well, I kind of juggle both, and this has been an adjustment and a learning curve for me, because as Russ said, I worked on the Collegian, I was a print journalism major here, But we did some some digital reporting, and I started out at New Hampshire Public Radio as a digital reporter, so mostly doing kind of writing for online and other online content, but they gave me opportunities and training to learn how to do the audio side of things. So at the convention, I was carrying around a backpack that was a good 30 pounds all over Philadelphia that had like various microphones, a recorder, my iPhone, lots of chargers and things like that, because at the convention, for example, I was there to get stories and features that I could churn out every day, and we have a little bit of a different news cycle than I think Anna and Kevin do, just because of the nature of public radio being a little bit more of a slow medium, I think, as opposed to kind of, the fast pace that you might see on others. But, I would be in the arena for the DNC, recording things, talking to people, but also taking pictures on my phone, taking video on my phone, tweeting and providing updates throughout the day that my editors back in New Hampshire could then curate into, maybe a running blog post or something like that. So I would be doing kind of two things at once in terms of getting string for a feature story that I would produce when I got back to my hotel room at midnight, and then also throughout the day working on other updates and things.
I'm interested in how you guys prepared to cover the campaign. Obviously, this is the first presidential campaign that each of you has covered. Back in the day, I don't want to sound too old here, but back in the day, there were more veteran reporters who covered presidential campaigns. You guys are young, so how did you prepare? Casey, why don't you start?
I didn't. I just kind of fell into it. I was still at the Monitor at the time and had started on the politics beat actually right after we have a really late state primary in New Hampshire. It's a little weird, but our presidential primary is really early in the year. Our state primary usually isn't until September. I jumped on the beat after that and covered our governor's race back in 2014. So had started to get to know some of the people who were, movers and shakers in the political scene, and became really interested in it. New Hampshire is a really kind of fascinating, quirky political state, so I immediately kind of became fascinated with all of the dynamics there. And as I said, at that time, you started to see Chris Christie was coming through a lot at that time because he was the head of the Republican Governors Association, so he was there trying to boost their candidate. And then you started to see Rick Perry and Ted Cruz and other people, and then Hillary Clinton came through for a final rally right before the 2014 elections. So I kind of followed that, and then once January rolled around in 2015, it became apparent that people were reaching out. I think I had a story that I wrote in January 2015 that had a lead that was something like, Mitt is making calls, Rand, Carly, and Rick are making trips, Donald is making statements about making trips. And it's so just kind of capturing, the Republican field was starting to take shape in New Hampshire. And from there, I just kind of stuck on covering it. And in terms of preparing for it, there wasn't a lot of preparation other than just kind of what you would do to cover any beat, reaching out to the people who have been involved in politics for a while, having a lot of coffees, doing a lot of phone conversations. I tried to kind of voraciously read various books that had been written on the primary or just read other national coverage of the primary. But I also came at it from the perspective of always having to remind myself that as a local reporter, I was covering this in a different way than Kevin would. Kevin's writing for a national audience, I was writing for a New Hampshire audience, so I always had to remind myself, what would matter or what would be most interesting to the people who have seen this cycle play out every 4 years on the ground in New Hampshire.
So for me, I grew up in Delco. I don't know if anyone here is from Delco. My mom is a Democrat, and my dad is a Republican, Irish, Italian, Catholic background. And every Sunday growing up, we would go to Mass and then watch Tim Russert on Meet the Press. And I was like a political junkie from like the time I could understand words. Then I got to Penn State, and I knew that I wanted to cover a presidential campaign. And when I would skip class in high school actually, and during the 2008 cycle, and I would literally hear Clinton, Obama, McCain, Palin rallies, and I'd go up to the back and I'd ask the journalist, like, how did you get your job? You have the coolest job in the world. You get to literally just go all over the country and cover a campaign. And they all looked exhausted, and I didn't understand why at the time. And then when I got to Washington after the Sandusky trial, I worked at Politico, and I just knew, I came on at like the tail end of the cycle, and I was like, I want to be an embed, as it's called, in 2016, and that was just what I wanted to do. And in order to do that, I specialized in financial policy, covering something known as TPA, which then ultimately became TPP, and the reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank, Dodd-Frank implementation, the Volcker Rule. I mean, this stuff was so boring, it could put you to sleep, literally chronicling the day-to-day minutia in the halls of Congress. But I was so bored one day, and my editor at Politico said, Donald Trump's Twitter got hacked. And I was like, I don't care that Donald Trump's Twitter got hacked, and it got hacked with Britney Spears lyrics. The Lil Wayne remix, actually, of this song called Scream and Shout. And my editor said to me, you need to reach out to Donald Trump about why his Twitter got hacked, and this was in 2013. And I was like, why do I care about Donald Trump's Twitter? Like, he's the host of The Apprentice, it doesn't matter. But I did it, and I got a comment from Michael Cohen, who is one of his senior legal counsel. And flash forward, when I was covering financial policy, and Donald Trump was leading in the polls and had just announced that he was running for president, and my best buddy, actually, from my fraternity at Penn State, Beta Theta Pi, texted me and said, what's up with Donald Trump? And I was like, I don't know, but I'm a political reporter, I'll try to find out. So I went into my email, and I was like, who do I know at the Trump Organization? Oh yeah, the guy who gave me a comment when Donald Trump's Twitter got hacked with Britney Spears lyrics. So I asked for an interview at 25 years old, and they were like, come on up. So I went at 25 years old and interviewed Donald Trump. And he threatened to run as a third-party candidate in that interview if the RNC did not treat him fairly. So overnight, that story obviously became a huge story. And suddenly, my editors were like, oh, you can get Trump? Like, okay, you need to cover Trump. And, how do you prepare? You really have to pace yourself, and you really have to give it your all, and kind of remind yourself how hard you work to cover a presidential campaign, even when it's exhausting or seemingly mundane. There really is no bigger story than covering a presidential campaign in an election year. And you rely on your very close friends and family to give you that boost of energy and jolt of energy that Red Bull won't always provide.
Yeah, so my story is nowhere near as beautiful and inspirational as Kevin's.
Britney Spears and Twitter doesn't.
Yeah. But it is a little different. So like 2 years ago when people were getting ready for the presidential campaign, Billy Penn was just being born. So we had it wasn't even like I didn't have contacts, it was like we had no contacts. I would call people and I'd be like, I'm from BillyPenn.com, and they're like, go away. They're like, what is a blog? I'm like, it's not a blog. But so that was really tough. And so sort of like what Casey said, like it was a lot of just like reaching out to people who I had never talked to before and doing so many coffees where I had to be like, so what is your job? Like, please tell me about what you do. But it was really helpful, and met with actually like a bunch of like random historians and like political historians in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania who I could find who were beyond helpful in helping me to better understand a city and a state that I hadn't really covered politics in that much before. So that was sort of the best way for me to prepare like practically, but I don't know if anything mentally can sort of prepare you to cover something like, especially this year. It's just been so sort of crazy and out of nowhere, and I don't really know if there's like any good way to prepare.
To piggyback off of that, because it was more than a campaign. I think like we, as political journalists, have sort of been conditioned to write palace intrigue stories about what's going on behind the scenes, but these were movements. Bernie Sanders packing a stadium, Donald Trump packing a stadium. Every day you were covering something. There was so much going on in that stadium. There was a racial protest going on. There was a jobs protest going on. There were acts of violence occurring. And so you were covering a microcosm in which anything could happen at any second. So it was more than just saying what Paul Manafort versus Corey Lewandowski meant. It was also telling the story of what these candidates who ultimately became symbols for various different things to various different people, what that meant as well.
I think it was also just really important to remember that at the end of the day, like, it's really easy to get caught up in kind of, you know, like Kevin said, like the palace intrigue, but politics is personal to a lot of people. And I think that one of the most important lessons that I learned and tried to remind myself is just to, you know, that this is about human beings' lives being affected in one way or another. People are very invested in the outcome of this for very different reasons, and just to, you know, make sure to always remember the kind of human beings at the heart of the story, whether that's on either side, whether that's the people who are in the audience, the people who stand up and ask questions at town halls because their mother has Alzheimer's, because their daughter has a disability, because whatever, you know, they're there because they care about something and want to do something to make it better. And I think that those were, you know, I tried as much as possible in my coverage to kind of focus on that side of things, because that, I think, can sometimes get lost in the, you know, this person is named staffer for this person, or the poll says this, or whatever.
I invite all of you to think of some questions and use one of the microphones up front here. And as you come down to the microphones, I'll ask a few more questions. Let's go back to the beginning, Casey, back in February and earlier than the primary campaign. You dealt with a lot of different candidates, a lot of different campaigns. I'm interested in how these candidates dealt with the press early on versus after the winnowing process when we just had Clinton and Trump.
It varies, and it depends on kind of at what point in the campaign. So some campaigns would reach out to you and would reach out to the local press and try to set up interviews. Other times you had to chase them down. Usually, a lot of the campaigns, even the larger ones, would make time for the local media in particular. And even Clinton, whenever she finally did start actually campaigning in spring of 2015, the I was one of the first interviews that she granted at the Concord Monitor, because they wanted to reach out to local press, and they deliberately picked local, I think there was a local TV station, a local newspaper, a local radio or something like that, and continued to do that on future trips because that was their target audience at that point. And similarly with a lot of the Republican candidates too. I think Donald Trump sat down with a number of newspapers, Bernie Sanders, things like that. So, but they also, New Hampshire is kind of unique in that a big part of their primary process is to pack people into town halls, and so there's the media component of getting the word out about what they're doing on the ground and who's visiting where, but also just getting the word out about the fact that, you know, Jeb Bush is going to be at this VFW in the middle of New Hampshire at X time, and making sure that he can get an audience there. And he was an interesting one because he was very different in person than what you saw on the debate stage, and I think that was also kind of an interesting lesson for me of this campaign, is what you see on TV and what you see once kind of people start paying attention to the race is much different than what you actually see on the ground when they're interacting with constituents face to face. He was much better in person, and I think he comes across at least more at ease. I think that, you know, some candidates are showmen, and they are showwomen and do well on a stage in front of a big audience. And some of them do much better in kind of small interpersonal conversations, you know, talking back and forth with someone. And I think he was the latter, definitely.
Anna, let me skip down to you. You were reporting from a city that was clearly going to vote for Hillary Clinton. But there was also some turmoil during the Democratic National Convention. The Sanders supporters there were obviously upset, not only the Clinton camp, but also the Democratic Party apparatus. What were the relationships between the press in Philadelphia and the two campaigns, the two Democratic campaigns?
I mean, I don't think it would be a surprise to say that the Clinton campaign was more experienced with working with press, I think, and that they were probably a little bit better to work with during that time. But that was also, I mean, as Casey was saying, like, that was a time when there was a lot of turmoil and a lot of people were really upset, and for very good and valid reasons. One of the most interesting stories that I did during the DNC was not in the Wells Fargo Center. It was where Sanders supporters had set up a week-long camp outside of the Wells Fargo Center, like literally in tents, and people had their kids with them. And I mean, it was like where the protesters were staying, where they were sleeping, and they were having campfires and making posters. And you know, it was something that a lot of people didn't get the chance to see because they were just watching the live stream of the speeches or whatever that may be. I also think that what it felt like, and maybe Casey, you can attest to this, like what it felt like in the Wells Fargo Center it was a lot stronger than what I saw on television, just because you could like hear and feel the just sort of like upset nature from these Sanders
It was
supporters.
interesting. I don't, as most millennials, I don't have cable, so like it was a very interesting experience this election to like, you know, digest a lot of what you saw of coverage, you know, through Twitter or through, you know, clips of cable, and then remind myself that what I am reading and consuming is very different than what a vast majority of America is reading and consuming about the election. And I think the DNC, the RNC, the debates were all kind of, these big media moments that may or may not have shaped the race in different ways, but there's a lot of little stuff that's happening on the ground that is a lot different, I think.
But it was big stuff. So, because I think in particular with Trump, and well, 2 points quickly, is that the media became an institution. Well, it's always been an institution, but was perceived, I think, perhaps more so in any other time as an institution in this race. And there were several candidates who ran actively against the media and criticizing the clickbait culture, if you will, of what political journalism, unfortunately, has somewhat become. But the second point is that I think with Trump and his message, particularly in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and North Carolina, is that the cable networks were focusing on the more bombastic lines in his speeches. But a huge portion, particularly in the final 2 weeks, if you will, of his closing argument on the stump was about Obamacare. And regardless of whether you are for or against the Affordable Care Act, it doesn't really matter. But to a certain portion of voters in the electorate who just had seen their premiums raised significantly, and again, regardless of who you want to blame for that, whether you blame the left or the right, his message resonated. And if you look at exit polling in particular, the overwhelming number of people who voted for Trump in those states listed the Affordable Care Act as one of the reasons. So I think, to her point, what you're seeing on social and what you're seeing on television is so different for a variety of reasons, some of which are good reasons, some of which are more sinister, about what is actually happening on the ground.
To that point, just one quick follow-up. You know, it's no secret that Donald Trump has had this combative relationship with the press. What about one-on-one for the embedded reporters? Was there a different relationship between those who traveled with him every day and his bombastic, you know, criticisms of the press in general? And I'm not speaking about his supporters, I'm just speaking about the candidate and the candidate's advisors.
I'm under no illusion that many in America, as well as in the Trump campaign, and honestly in Hillary Clinton's campaign, who also, by the way, blamed the press for her loss in a conference call with donors just the other day, that they are mistrusting of the media. You know, look, anyone who followed Donald Trump's candidacy saw that on the stump he made it a point to, when you're in a state, I pretended, Russ, that I was on the opposing team of an NBA Finals. Like when you walk into a stadium and have thousands of people booing at you and calling you dishonest and like, you know, other names that I won't say. I was like, okay, this is what Allen Iverson must have felt like against the Lakers when they called out his name. But privately, you know, I think like any industry, you develop trust sources and you develop, you know, he was a politician, and when I covered Congress, there were members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who were easier to work with than others, and also people who I would care not to speak with. And I think that he was just like any other politician behind the scenes in that regard.
Yes, sir.
My name is Frank Esposito. I'm a senior studying journalism here and also a collegiate writer right now.
I'm having a hard time. I can't hear you.
I can, okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you guys handle some ethical issues with sources? Mainly people want to go off the record. Those anonymous texts at 3 a.m. saying something's going to happen. How do you guys go about evaluating those sources, crediting them, and trying to do the best job you can?
To me, this was really just, it's just, you just know, I mean, like, and whether it's journalism or any other industry, you know when you can trust someone. And I think you just gotta trust your gut. And I know that's a really basic, simple answer, but there's an industry of politics that I think kind of adds a complexity to it, because people are always looking out not only for their influence and power, but also for their next job, especially in the political advising industry and lobbying industry. But you just know when you can trust someone or when you can't. And that, to me, comes down to a gut feeling.
I think, sorry, this might be a little bit different, but I know I often would get kind of off the record, here's an interesting story that you might want to pick up on. And usually, sometimes it would be interesting, but sometimes it would be like, we have a staffer doing this, or we have, and it might be interesting, but I tried to establish a reputation as someone who was a little bit more discerning with those pitches, with my sources, and, always be civil in explaining, why I wasn't picking up on that story. But I didn't want to come to be known as a journalist who was just going to repeat everything that was fed to me. And I would like to think that my sources learned that over time, and then that would help them in terms of giving me interesting information that would actually be of use to my readers. And I tried to always explain, well, this is the kind of story that, if you think it would be interesting to pitch to us, this is what it would be, as opposed to just, maybe you guys are doing an event here or whatever, and you just want to get out some extra PR for it.
Yeah, I think going off of that, it's really important to be honest with your sources about what you want and what you're looking for and what your readers want. Same with Casey, I was constantly getting emails from campaign officials off the record, blah, 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 you should cover this dumb thing our opponent's doing later. I'm like, well, I work for a news organization that is probably never going to cover your press conference, because that's just not how we operate. But I'm really interested in, if you have any weird stories about a campaign staffer who does something strange on the side, then maybe I'll check it out. So I think being super open with your sources about what you're looking for, like what Casey said, is key.
And I think also just recognizing too that each of you does have a job to do. That person's job is to maybe pitch you stories that you're not gonna ever write about.
And they probably know that.
Exactly. And I think just being respectful to the extent that it's possible, and understanding again that there's a human being on the other side of it too is helpful.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for coming, first of all, but it's no secret to anybody in this room that most people do not trust the media, and they don't like the media. That's just the way it is. And I noticed through the rise of Trump, there's been a dramatic rise in internet activity through the alternative media, with sources like Breitbart, or even guys like Paul Joseph Watson that just make videos on YouTube. These alternative media forms are rising dramatically, especially with the rise of Trump. More people are turning to this now than CNN or any traditional news source. Do you guys see that maybe within, I don't want to say maybe 10 years, that these alternative sources might be a threat to Bloomberg, Politico, CBS, CNN, or any traditional news network?
I think that the way we consume news, we are all news consumers, right? And so as a result of being a consumer, you have a choice for where you go to get your news. So I think that will never change. And I think that, people always ask me, for example, where do you get your news? And when people criticize the media, I try to be like, well, news should be like a diet. You can't always have candy. You can't always have ice cream. You have to have, I love candy and I love pizza, but I can't eat that every day. And I also try to remind people that they have power in what they click. And so, particularly with cable news, you have power with what you view or what you tune into, but a lot of times, you see this in social and Facebook, and where they think, and I just try to respond like, well, all of these stories that maybe are really boring, or maybe are longer form, or not taking a side, if you will, they might not be as sexy as some of the more less, some of the clickbait stories, but they're equally as important. And I think that when a consumer feels empowered in that regard, that they have control, I think that I found shifts the conversation. And so, you know, with the outlets that you specifically mentioned, I think that the internet will always exist, and I think that there are different voices that are being represented, right, wrong, or indifferent, and I'm not alluding to any specific one, but I think that we as news consumers have power in what we click and what we consume.
I also think you have to think about it from the perspective of the platform and where people are getting that information from. A lot of people aren't just typing in these alternative websites into their Google search or whatever the URL is. They're getting it from Facebook. And I think that Facebook is going to very much change within the next 10 years, probably sooner rather than later. And I think the conversation around, you know, and obviously some of the news organizations you named aren't fake news per se, but there's been a huge conversation about fake news being circulated on Facebook. You know, I was just telling people earlier that a close family member of mine who's very intelligent quoted a meme earlier that she saw on Facebook that was like totally, completely false. And I think that, and I really think that that's going to fundamentally change because I think that consumers on Facebook are going to demand it.
Yeah,
I don't know if I agree with that, to be honest, because I don't think people are demanding it yet.
Maybe not consumers on Facebook are going to demand it, but I think that institutions will demand it.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, even just in the last week after the election, I think there's been a lot of emphasis on Facebook's role in the election and Facebook's role in propagating or failing to kind of provide adequate markers or adequate cues for people as to what is and is not a valid news source. I personally have been thinking about a lot kind of what my responsibility is as a journalist on Facebook, as someone who interacts with people both personally and professionally on Facebook and sees a number of my family members sharing memes that are not accurate. And you know, a lot of my reporting and journalistic activity right now takes place on Twitter because that's just the place that I gravitate toward, but that's a very different bubble than what exists on Facebook. So, you know, now knowing that there is such a kind of universe of misinformation out there, I'm now thinking, okay, well, do I have a responsibility to put more factual information out into the world or to, you know, provide more kind of what I think are your kind of vegetables of your news diet in the hopes that that might reach more people, at least in my kind of small segment of that universe.
And I just think it's important to note that I think that we can all have the conversation about whether a particular social media platform has too much power, too little power, or is puppeteering a certain way or whatever. But again, I think when the onus is on the individual and the news consumer, like the individual, about what are you actually reading? Are you just reading from a news source or a think piece that only reiterates your point of view? Or are you taking the 10 minutes of your time on your phone to go to a competing thought ideological background to understand perhaps the policy behind that? And I'm not talking about, and like there are reputable, progressive, ideological news sites, and there are reputable, conservative, ideological news sites. And I think that when the onus is on the individual, anyone can, what's the difference nowadays between a column and a rant on Facebook? I think that the consumer has a little bit more ownership, and I would just continue to harp on that point.
Thank you.
There's been a lot of self-flagellation by the press over the last week. We might as well engage in a little bit of that ourselves. Let's start in Pennsylvania. Donald Trump became the first Republican since 1988 to win the state. He took 53 of the 67 counties. He was clear that Hillary Clinton was going to win Philadelphia. But what went wrong elsewhere in terms of what the press reported? Why didn't we know what was going to happen in Pennsylvania?
Well, last week I published an article called 6 Things I Got Wrong About Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. I encourage you all to read it. It's hard. I think a lot went wrong, and you're right, there has been a lot of self-reflection in the media over the last week or so. There's a conversation about, well, have reporters in cities gotten out enough into more rural areas rather than parachuting in for an event? Have they really gotten to know those areas so that they can sort of understand the scope of this movement? Because that's what it was a movement, and maybe journalism as an industry, didn't realize how large that was. I also think that during a presidential election year, especially this year, there's a lot that we can do as reporters to better report on polls. The number of polls that we wrote about that had sample sizes of like 500 or 600 people, and then we throw it out there as if it's an accurate representation of what the entire state of Pennsylvania is feeling at that point. It's just an incorrect interpretation, in my view, of what these polls are supposed to do, and maybe it's also how those pollsters are peddling them out to the media. But there was a lot that went wrong. I specifically wrote over and over again, if you win the Philadelphia suburbs, you can win Pennsylvania. That didn't seem to matter this year. Donald Trump was able to flip counties that we hadn't even considered, really. We were so focused on the Philadelphia suburbs. And so that was kind of the difference maker for us, was we were so focused on a geographic area that the campaigns were too. It just didn't prove to be as fruitful for them as we kind of expected.
Casey, in New Hampshire, Clinton won by like a point.
I don't know the exact margin, but I do know that they only just called it yesterday at like 5 p.m., so it was a squeaker. But
What were the final polls suggesting up there, and did everybody miss it?
I don't know. There were actually a few polls that came out in the last few weeks that had Trump up. And I think that a lot of people, myself included, kind of looked at those with, a little bit of that's interesting, because I think that a lot of us did expect Clinton to win. But I will say that Donald Trump got his first win in New Hampshire, and it was not insignificant. And if you went to any of his rallies there, as with many of the other states that he went on to, he was packing them in, and even in towns that had been traditionally working class, kind of democratic strongholds. So I think that again is another example of where I don't know that I necessarily expected him to win the presidency or to win as many states as he did, but having seen my colleagues reporting and other people's reporting, and just followed him on the ground just through other people's reporting, because I was not personally covering him in New Hampshire, it was not surprising to me that he picked up as much of a movement as he did.
And Kevin, how about from inside the bubble? I mean, you saw Republicans 24 hours a day, you saw Trump people 24 hours a day. Did you realize there was the Democratic side out there?
It was two bubbles, right? Because Washington is such a bubble, and the Trump world is such a bubble, and you're constantly being spun, no matter what campaign you cover, by the campaign that you cover. And then you also, I remember I would get like a day off a week to go home, not off, but to go back to Washington to do laundry. And anytime you could just feel it. I mean, the notion of how far-fetched the perception of Trump's movement was, and how it was just never going to go anywhere, it wasn't organized, and no one took it seriously, and that they were all of the JV advisors, and the rejects, and he was never going to do it. And so you were constantly like going in and out of two very different worlds. Look, right up until election day, we all said that he was in striking distance in Florida, he was leading in Ohio, he was in striking distance in North Carolina. The internals of Hillary Clinton's campaign had her making stops in Michigan and Wisconsin. And so his path was narrow, but he needed to turn out the base, and he needed to really motivate people to get to the polls. And especially in those final 4 days, we were covering campaign rallies until 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. in the morning. And when you're in a barn in Leesburg, Virginia, which he lost, but the margin was a lot closer than anyone anticipated, at 1 a.m. in the morning, and he's 4 hours behind schedule, and you come in after being in like 5 states that day, and you look around and there's 2,000 people there, and you're like, these people are standing around for 4 hours on a Sunday, now Monday morning, to hear this guy speak. Like, they're sure as heck gonna show up to vote. And So, did we miss it? I don't think we listened enough. And I think that journalism has to come back to listening. And that's what I'll say.
Hi, my name is Alana and I'm a media studies major. This is sort of following up to Kevin saying that the power of the individual can really help decide what news organizations get propagated. So when this election has shown that the average person is maybe not nearly as media literate as we thought they once were, can we really rely on the power of the individual to change the media landscape? And is it safe to say that selective exposure is sort of killing our democracy?
Well, I think what I mean in terms of the power of the individual is that there's a power in signaling to the media what we as consumers want and what information we want to know about. And so that's my point on that. And then in terms of, I don't think that we're killing the democracy, no.
I disagree. I don't know. I just think that one of the more troubling aspects of this election to me has been the degree to which people live in different realities. And I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal did this really interesting interactive earlier this year called Red Feed, Blue Feed, and it kind of illustrated the extent to which, based on the power of the individual and what you choose to click on, you eventually will curate a Facebook feed that reflects back to you your own ideals and your own beliefs. And I think that it would be helpful, I'm skeptical that this would ever actually happen, if media literacy were taught like math. I think that it's just a core value that you need in today's society, and to have a healthy democracy, I don't know how you arrive at a curriculum for that. I don't know how you get schools to buy into that, but I think that it's essential if you want to live in a world where people can discern information and discern what is fact from fiction.
I don't think it's killing our democracy, but I think it's good that you recognize that there is an echo chamber that we all surround ourselves with, ourselves included. And I think that sort of goes back to some of the listening issues that we talked about. I sit on Twitter every day and talk to a bunch of reporters. So I'm constantly hearing the media side of things. A lot of people are constantly hearing the left side of things. A lot of people are constantly hearing the right side of things. Media literacy would be awesome if everybody was taught that, and then everybody would have the sort of self-awareness that you have, that you realize that, it's so easy to surround yourself with that. I don't have an answer for it. I don't think it's killing our democracy, but I do think that people need to be aware that now more than ever they're surrounding themselves with like-minded ideas, and that's why I think it's so important, like what Kevin was saying earlier, to try as hard as you can to read reputable news organizations that are coming at issues from a different perspective than you.
And yeah, I think one of the most frustrating things that was very difficult to express during maybe I shouldn't say this, but during the campaign cycle was a lot of people who were commentating on the campaign or opining punditry on the campaign had never even been to a Trump rally, or had been reverberating memes or ratcheting up rhetoric, and it was very confusing to me why this was allowed to happen. And especially when you're in an industry which is incredibly competitive, where every media TV hit, as it's called, it matters, and every tweet matters, and how many followers you have, and all that stuff matters. Well, it's like, no, actually, none of that stuff matters. Like, I didn't get into journalism to tweet. I didn't get into journalism to do a TV hit. You get into journalism, hopefully, because you want to give people a voice, and you want to, actually have a front row seat. And so it was very, and you have to resist that, because everyone has a right to write and be on whatever they want to say, but I think there really is, a really great journalist said this the other day on Morning Joe, there's something to be said for showing up, especially when you're in your 20s, and going there, and doing it, because no one can take it away from you. And when you speak, I think, particularly about the campaign, you come at it with a level of experience that no one can take away from you. So I think going there and really showing up matters, and I think we should demand that from our journalists.
Thank you.
So if you guys were in charge of your own news organizations 4 years from now, what would you order your reporters to do differently?
Go there, show up.
Okay. What else? How can these budding journalists out here be better political reporters 4 years from now?
Look a little closer than we did. I think like as Kevin was alluding to earlier, there was it's so easy to sort of get sucked up in like the punditry of everything and the opining of everything, and it's easy to pay attention to that because it's way sexier. But I think I would tell my reporters to one, be a little more analytical with some of the information that we were being given from independent pollsters and from the campaigns. And I would also tell them to get out way more than we did. And I thought that we got out a lot, but not enough. You can always get out more. And I would have had them spend more time in the neighborhoods that we didn't spend as much time in, and getting to know what those voters were thinking about and what the issues that were important to them were.
Yeah, I think just echoing what they said. I mean, I think listen has been kind of like the primary lesson that I have taken away from this election. Is just, and that goes for both sides and both reporters and journalists trying to cover it, but also I think that it would be helpful if just citizens at large took the time to kind of listen to one another beyond just, seeing, oh, that person is angry, and stopping to consider, why is that person angry? And I think also, I think it's valid to report on maybe some of the more inflammatory statements that were made or some of the more controversial things that happened, but I do think that sometimes those dominated the news cycle in a way that took away from the actual issues of the campaign, or the, maybe gave outsized weight to some things, so that when maybe something more serious was said, it was like kind of a boy cried wolf situation. But it's hard to know in the moment kind of what kind of weight to give to something.
Hi, I'm Karen. I'm a junior this year, and I'm in political science. I was wondering about one of the headlines I hear from Donald Trump is his daughter, Ivanka. She's known as his secret weapon. My question to you is, do you think he would have won without his daughter? And she's not even a political figure. How could she have become so powerful? She's like, this is...
I love this question because everyone always like, who's the secret weapon? Like, it's always, and we always say it's typically the spouse is the secret weapon, or like, and it's like, it's just weird to think of people as the secret weapon. I think that what was so interesting is that progressives always have Hollywood, right? And we saw this with Bruce Springsteen. He packed 40,000 people the night before of the election in Philly. And Donald Trump was like had Ted Nugent. No, not offering my opinion on it either. But I think what we saw was that Trump's children were his top surrogates, and they connected in a way to the electorate, especially to baby boomers, because it kind of was like, okay, he may say all of these crazy bombastic things, but he raised, look at his children, and they always say that the best reflection of an individual is their children. And I think people feel the same way about Chelsea Clinton as well. But I can tell you from experience that the reaction that I saw between the Trump children and voters was one of great respect. And I can also say that they were some of the most professional surrogates that I interacted with in covering the campaign for a year and a half. So, anytime you enter into the political season, I think the latest clickbait story I saw was her on 60 Minutes with her bracelet, and it's going viral right now. But she's always worn her own stuff, in fairness to her. So that's what I'll say about that.
I actually, do you mind if I go back to the last question, because I just thought of something else? Sorry. My brain is still kind of coming out of election mode, but yeah, more so. But so one of the things that I think that news news organizations at large did not do, and I think it was hard to do because it was hard to pin Trump down on what his policies actually were, but there was not a lot of extensive examination or analysis of what a Trump presidency would actually look like. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the last week, but I don't think that there was as much weight given to examining what is he realistically going to do in his first 100 days? Can he deport the number of people that he says he's going to deport? What is he going to do with the Affordable Care Act? And we're seeing a lot of that now kind of after the fact, but there was not a lot of taking him as seriously as you might take any other presidential candidate on a policy level beforehand.
Just what you feared the most, a question from your old professor. So the White House is becoming less and less transparent. Obama has done fewer press briefings and more one-on-one interviews so he can control the message. And clearly social media plays a role in this because the more people you have around, the more likely there is that something's going to suddenly pop out. What do you think is going to happen with a Trump presidency? And how transparent do you think that the next administration is going to be, and what implications does it have for people like us?
Well, I think that the first part of your question is spot on. I mean, I think that President Obama's lack of transparency has been, unfortunately, part of a trend, and it's pretty astounding, and he deserves criticism for that, rightfully so. And as does any president or politician who butts against a transparency. And look, President-elect Trump has butted the norms repeatedly in terms of tradition with the press, from something as basic as not being able to travel on Trump Force One. There were rallies, there was at least one rally in particular that I'm thinking of the final week, where he went on stage without the traveling press corps being in attendance and ditching them in the motorcade. And this is where I think this really ties it all together, because we as journalists have a choice in that moment. You can either make it about you, or you can try to make it about the reader, and you can complain about not being there and having him go on stage, and you're so annoyed and what have you. That doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, if there was a bomb threat like there was the Saturday before the election and the traveling press corps isn't there, ultimately it's bigger than a candidate, it's bigger than a president, and it serves the reader to let the reader know that there have been 10 or 15 reporters and 10 or 15 different perspectives who have been covering the said candidate for a year and a half in the room, chronicling what exactly happens. And I think that where voters and the public's mistrust of the media really hurts is that ultimately it doesn't really hurt us, it hurts them. And if they think that it's not important to have a journalist in the room or to have a journalist in the Brady briefing room in the White House, because what does it really matter? You're just going to go on Twitter and write a snarky tweet, then they ultimately lose out. And I don't think that we as an industry have communicated that effectively, and I think we need to bad.
Thank you. Just in closing, and I'm speaking, I think, on behalf of the ethics students out there who may be interested. Because of the contentiousness of this campaign, and Kevin, I think, alluded to this, the hundreds of commentary, maybe, as opposed to factual reporting. Did you guys ever find it difficult to play it straight, to be objective reporters, as opposed to letting your own feelings guide your reporting?
I don't think I ever necessarily found it hard to not let my own feelings guide it. I think what has been hard is that reporters and journalists have had to redefine what objectivity means in a lot of ways, and I think that it's important for reporters to focus and strive for accuracy, and if that means calling a lie, then that's something that reporters should get used to, and that's something that they should do. I think that objectivity there's been so many conversations about, like, is objectivity dying, and like, I don't really know if, like, true objectivity ever really existed. All of us are coming at this with different life experiences. And so, I don't know if that was ever really a attainable goal for us. But what I do think is that the definition of objectivity and what we've traditionally seen that as, it certainly changed. And certainly, there were plenty of news organizations that were looking inward saying, should we have this lower third that says, a candidate said this, that's not true. I'm sure those conversations happened. Personally, and this is a personal opinion, I don't think that's bad for journalism. I don't think calling a lie is going to send us down the wrong path.
I agree with everything Anna said. I think that often, and I fell into this whenever I was a student especially, you kind of develop this idea that objectivity means you have two sides, you give both sides equal weight, end of story. And that's not really what objectivity is. I think that there are basic standards of this is right, this is wrong, or this is true, this is false. And we as a profession, like Anna said, need to get more comfortable saying when something is wrong, saying when something is racist, saying when something is sexist, just textbook definition. I think that that's a good thing for us to maybe get out of our silos, because I think that sometimes it's uncomfortable, particularly the news media is a pretty, it does not have as much diversity as it should and does not necessarily reflect what the rest of America looks like racially, economically, otherwise. And I think that sometimes the definition of what is objectivity gets made by, if I'm being honest, a lot of white men. Yeah. And I think that once you get more voices in the room and realize that, a lot of your news consumers have a much different idea of what is fair and what is right than you, I think that that kind of gives some good perspective on how to approach your coverage.
Kevin will give you the last word.
I think that ultimately it all comes down to your gut and trusting your instincts and just being true to yourself. And so that includes what you tweet, what you post, what you say publicly. You have to play it straight and recognize that your view is not for yourself. It's to give a broader view to a mass number of people. And if people feel that they can trust you, they will continue to I think, respect you. And trust is a two-way street. You have to constantly recognize that you're not getting access for yourself. You're getting access for people, all different backgrounds, wherever they are throughout the country and increasingly the world.
One more question.
Hello. So going off what you said about calling out that something is a lie, or just saying something bad about something that people might not want to hear, you probably have to have a lot of confidence to do that. So how do you sort of deal with that whenever you're something sort of, how much it needs to be said?
That's a great question. We always say reporters have to have a really thick skin. Whether that's readers telling you you're wrong, or that's sources telling you you're wrong, or that's your editor telling you you're wrong. You have to have a really thick skin. But I also think that we so often say that, and we forget that reporters are real human beings too. They're not just thick-skinned robots that can take anything. So what I always tell people is to have your thick skin at work and stay strong. And then, if you had a particularly rough day where you had to be the bearer of bad news to someone who didn't want to hear it, go home, sit with a friend, get it all out, cry a little, one of my favorite activities when I'm sad at the end of the day, and get over it and wake up the next morning and do it again, and it's fine. And it comes with the territory. And that's just part of being a reporter, is being able to deliver that type of news. It's also something you just get used to. I don't really cry every night.
I think one of the other things that I can't take credit for this lesson, but it's something that I've heard repeated by other more seasoned journalists, is it's good to make sure that your sources are never surprised by what they read in one of your stories. So if you're going to print some kind of giant, I'm blanking blanking on the word, but like this big expose on someone, then you need to have sat down and given someone a chance to respond to what you're going to print. And I think that, that doesn't mean letting them read and edit it beforehand, but sometimes that means saying, I'm going to print this, or this is what my facts and my reporting has shown me, or what people are saying and telling me, and giving them a chance to respond. I think that I would hope that they would respect you more for that in the end, even if they don't like what is actually being printed.
What's your name?
Mark.
This is a really good question. Because for me, and Professor Eshelman probably won't believe this, but I really struggle with that competence question. Like, why is a kid from Delco allowed to ask now the president-elect questions or get access to these people? Like, who am I to have, like, that's crazy to me, and I've struggled with that. Multiple storylines that I've covered. But you have to constantly remind yourself that you're not you. And when you are representing and speaking for your audience, and it has to come back to the reader. And it has to come back to, well, you know what? Who I am and who I represent matters. Like, me, Kevin Cirilli, does not matter. But Delco matters. And these towns that we're in matter. And you become a representative to that person, whether they're an attorney, whether they're a victim of a crime, whether they're accused of a crime, or whether they're president-elect, that they have to answer. And that's the bedrock of what we do. But little tricks, drink a lot of water, and
Call your mom when you need to.
Have surround yourself with really good people, but also just like, I've always found that whenever I'm super nervous, just owning the fact that I'm nervous. I said this in his office before. I was like, I'm really nervous right now. And like just acknowledging that you're nervous can sometimes like put people at ease and like kind of break that tension. And even if I'm in an interview or like before a hit on or something, just telling someone like there are so many memories that are coming to mind right now, and just saying like, I'm really nervous, and then they'll be like, oh, like, you don't have to be nervous right now, like, you've done this before, like, and that really helps. So own it, and then remind yourself the responsibility that you have that's bigger than yourself. I really like that question.
Thank you very much.
Very nice question. Before we say thank you to our panel, I'd like to acknowledge one other political expert in the room. Former Lieutenant Governor Bob Jubileer is here with us tonight. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and please join me in congratulating or thanking our guests.